Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I guess our panelists can come up. We may as well take a seat. Thank you all for coming. I think this is a really interesting platform to discuss this issue. I think Republica has done a great job on bringing together, the issues of digital society with political and social issues of the moment. So really glad to be here today. I guess first I'll introduce our panelists. First we have Aisling Hedderman, who is a community organizer with the North Dublin Bay Housing Crisis Committee. And she's going to talk to you about grassroots organizing and community mobilization, which has been really, really key in coming up with solutions to the housing crisis and pushing for better access to affordable and social housing. We have Lucky Khambule, who is the founder of MASI, the Movement for Asylum Seekers in Ireland. He himself has been living in direct provision for the last 4 years, which is a system of institutionalized living for asylum seekers in Ireland. Basically, people who are not given the right to work in this country, often not even given the right to cook their own food, and living in for-profit institutions in this country. And he's going to talk to you about some of the challenges for people both within those institutions, but also when they come out and have to face trying to get access to the rental market or to housing in this country. And finally, we have Tommy Gavin, who is an independent journalist and media coordinator for the Irish Housing Network, which is, I guess, an umbrella group of housing rights activism and organizations that has been really key in driving the conversation about the housing crisis here in Ireland. And he was also involved with the occupation of Apollo House last year, which was really a watershed moment where there was an occupation of a vacant NAMA building in the centre of Dublin and really brought huge support for housing rights activists and a lot of acknowledgement of how bad the housing crisis in the city has gotten. So I think it's I sort of chose the title of this thing. I have the pleasure of dating someone who works in tech, and he was pretty upset with the idea of a tech bubble rather than boom. But I thought it was, the issue of a tech bubble, not only in economic terms, but in the fact that people who work in tech in this country tend to be often living in somewhat of a bubble and don't often engage sometimes with some of the political issues that are of huge urgency in the city. And we end up with a city that is sort of divided into two very different realities. So hoping today to bring you some really unique perspectives from people who are really on the front lines of this crisis. So I guess if we begin with you, Aisling, when we talk about tech, I know that a lot of these big corporations, big tech companies like to, show themselves to be platforms for activism and platforms for social change. But I know in your work you found that a lot of the impact that you've been able to bring to the crisis has been through community organizing. Can you speak to us about sort of how you got involved with the Housing Crisis Committee and what mobilizing and activism has looked like for you? Mm-hmm. I think so. Do you want to take this?
Hello. Hi. Thanks very much for inviting me here today to speak. The reason that we started up in the North Dublin Bay Housing Crisis community was we were a group of parents that were affected by the increase in rents, and a political party held a meeting regarding to the housing crisis 3.5 years ago, and we went to the meeting and we found at that meeting that the solutions that could be brought forward were not being listened to by those affected. There was a new legislation passed in 2014 which was introduced in the HAP scheme, which is Housing Assistance Payment, which is going to replace social housing and push an awful lot of families into the private market and taking responsibility away from the government and the council in providing social housing. So we set up in order to ensure that those tenants that were going to be pushed into the private market for a long time would know their rights, and we found that there wasn't many rights for those that are in the private market, never mind the increase in rents and security of tenure. So we came together as a group of parents that are affected, and we set up North Dublin Bay Housing Crisis Community in order to highlight what was going on.
And I mean, rising rents is a huge issue in Dublin, and I think that the tech boom in Dublin has been sort of given the blame for fueling these rising rents. I know the issues with Airbnb and short-term rentals has been a big issue in the city as well. How is gentrification in the city that is, possibly in part fueled by the boom in the tech industry, affected communities already living in these areas? How are you seeing the situation in the city change?
Yeah, unfortunately, we can look at the IFSC as an example. Brilliant tech bubble, corporations are all able to go to this one area, and we have seen communities change because of that. And you can look at the local Sheriff Street and how that has all changed, and they've pushed families out of social housing and into the private sector. And how they've done that now is by changing social housing initiative to voluntary housing, and voluntary housing is now under the RTB, which is the Private Residential Tenancy Board, but they took the private part out now to also include social housing. So what we've seen with the gentrification of the city centre and how the tech bubble has kind of pushed an awful lot of families out, unfortunately it's got to do with paying extra rent, by taking up the accommodation, and by the builds not actually happening. We can see cranes all over Dublin City, but it's not actually building homes, it's building offices and it's building companies. So what we've seen, an awful lot of families coming to us in relation to being outsourced of the market in the city centre, has pushed inflation of the prices of rents in the suburbs as well. So we're seeing an awful lot more families coming to us in the suburbs because they can't afford to stay in the suburbs, never mind the city. If you look at the city, we've got an awful lot of student accommodation also being built, which would accommodate the tech bubble. But when these families, when an awful lot of professionals in the tech world would be professionals, young professionals, with not an awful lot of families that would be looking for accommodation in the city. So we are seeing families being affected and pushed out of the city as rents are being increased because, not unfortunately, it's great for the tech world that they can afford to stay in the city. Mm-hmm. But when the families come, the children come, they too may also be outpriced because it's difficult in the private rental market, never mind in the mortgage, because anybody can lose their home through mortgage arrears nowadays as well.
And I mean, I guess there's been some talk about this idea of a trickle-down effect. If you build, even high-priced housing, that will sort of take, kind of cushion the impact of more people coming in, and that will free up housing for lower-income families. But I'm guessing that's not really working from what you're seeing.
No, because as they build the tech world in the city centre, we're going to see more and more businesses and companies coming to the city. So that will mean more employment for the profession. But we're not going to see housing being provided for families. We're going to see housing provided for single people and couples. But that will only be done through high rents. The rents is the main focus on this, is that as long as people are willing to pay the high rents, it's going to continuously push up the rents. And we can see that though through the City Council with the housing assistance payment. They're paying higher rates, but it doesn't make sense to pay a private investor this amount of money when the council could build homes and take that money themselves. Even if they wanted to have their own private market, they could create their own private market for those families that are affected. You have to look at the workplace as well. If it is tech, that is the main upcoming job and profession, the other professions are being forgotten about and the wages aren't being paid. As you see low-income families working in McDonald's for low minimum wage, they can't afford the high rents, but yet they are working families. The image of homelessness is not just about social housing and you're not working to be able to afford that home. It's now being pushed up into the private rent. It's an awful lot of professions. Like you can see some of the army wives have been out protesting about their men not being able to afford, or their wives not being able to afford the rent, or having to use food banks. So we're actually seeing it now move up from only those that are on social welfare into professions that are public service professions.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's very hard when we're talking about divergent realities and a sort of a divided city. We have this idea of, the government is pushing this image of recovery and the Celtic phoenix, and that is true for some people in this city, but sort of what is the future looking like for people who are left behind by that recovery? Do you see the housing crisis worsening? Has there been any improvement? And what really is the reality there at the moment?
Okay, the reality is it's not getting better. Today I had 5 phone calls in the private rented accommodation because they've all been issued notices, and this is to drive up the rents. An awful lot of landlords are using the excuse to push families out of their homes, and what we're finding is it's an awful lot of invalid notices. This means that an awful lot of people don't know about their rights and what kind of procedures that they have to take once they fight. It's very hard, once they fight to keep their home, what services will they be using next if they can't keep their home, because the rights are all for the landlords more so than any tenants. And by any tenants, that means also those in the tech bubble.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And obviously one of the new solutions that the government has been proposing are these family hubs, which maybe you can tell us more about and whether that really is a solution at all.
All right. Well, today, as we can see from the figures, last month in July, there was an extra 200 children forced into emergency accommodation, and the council have come up with this idea that they are going to create hubs, family hubs, instead of using the hotels and B&B services. Now, we don't see any different to the hotels and the B&B services. It's just that it's going to be confined, and children are going to be confined in the one building. They say that there's extra services that they will be able to access, but there's not a lot of families out there that don't need mental health services, don't need addiction services. They've become homeless through no fault of their own. They've become homeless because of the private sector. So what we're finding with the hubs, the information is leaking out slowly. It's hard to get the information, but so far they've planned 19 hubs in Dublin city centre, and they're all going to be, well, most of them are going to be privately run, and that's where the charity sector is going to be brought in to run these services, or privatised to outsources. As we found with the family hubs, they're going to be under an awful lot of rules and restrictions, and these rules and restrictions will actually confine the family life. It won't actually improve it, and we'll see that because of, an example would be time slots for cooking dinners. So if you miss your time slot, your child's not going to be fed. There's also going to be dinners brought in by one of the services, Aramac, and they're going to bring in food services. We're also going to find no visitors. There's no Garda vetting for other families that are there, so families could be living among anybody and they won't know any of their criminal convictions. They'll be allowed into services. What we find with the family hubs is that they're not a solution. It's going to be a revolving door for the private market. And as we see an awful lot of families move back into the private market through the HAP scheme, they won't be socially housed, they'll be actually pushed back into the private market. They will actually find themselves back in these family hubs. But it's not only families that are at risk that are looking for social housing, it's anybody that's in private renting is looking to go into these if they can't afford to find an alternative. The hubs is a frightening it's a frightening thought. I'm at risk of homeless myself, and the thought of bringing my 2 children into a facility that is going to be full of other people that are in the same situation, but we won't be able to connect with each other, you won't be allowed to talk to each other, you won't be able to engage, you won't have social events together, there probably more than likely won't be any residence committees set up, and there's no advocacy for those that are in that service. The service is independent, more or less, to DCC, so all complaints will have to go through the council. They will not be taken up with these private companies or charities that are going to be taken over.
Okay. When I was doing some research for this, for the panel, I found out about a startup in San Francisco called Tech Equity that was working on trying to connect tech workers and people in the tech industry with community organizations and activists, which I thought was a really unique idea. Rather than getting a sort of tech solution, bringing it back to human connection and people meeting other people and getting together. You know, how can people who are maybe not directly affected by this crisis, contribute support or engage with community groups and activism to sort of help push for a solution?
I think there's many ways that the tech world can get involved. It's about changing the the ideology behind homelessness and those at risk of homelessness, and actually the housing crisis and how many people are actually affected by getting the true stories out there. As we look at the media kind of prints the same stories and have a negative role on it. They don't change the role to actually push for social housing or public housing, to ensure that those voices are heard. I think that there's many ways that those in the tech world can actually get involved. They can get involved with the homeless runs by collecting food in their companies, or individually they can get involved by actually sharing the true stories of those affected. There's many ways of actually connecting the tech world with the community organisations as well, because social media is such a big way of getting the message out there, and an awful lot of people that are in communities that wouldn't be educated, wouldn't have an idea how to set up an email, and there's so many resources that could be used. The tech world can come into communities and actually to help teach, free of charge, help teach those in the community how to use email and how to connect with each other an awful lot better, instead of just being on an app where it's not in a real world. We need face-to-face connection, and we need humanity connections.
Definitely. And I think it's to sort of seg from the issue of the family hubs, which is another sort of form of institutionalized living, which we have a serious problem with in this country, to the experience of direct provision. And Lucky, you've been a tireless activist for the rights of people in direct provision, and you're dealing with a threat of eviction yourself at the moment in your accommodation. Maybe you can talk about your current situation and the demonstration you have planned for tomorrow, and what sort of brought you to this point.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, we are really, really affected by this whole housing crisis, and personally as well. I've been looking for the house for the past 7 months now, and being in the center that belongs to the government, they've been pushing us to find a place, or threatening with evicting us from the place that we are, because they say they need the space. Because once you are granted and your residency in direct provision, then you're supposed to move. But we are faced with the same problems that Caelainn just spoke about, and they have been shifting these dates from July actually, and tomorrow was the actual deadline. And when I heard about this talk, that really disturbed me personally, because now I had to, organize the people who are affected just like me, to try and make a plan that will make the people to resist what it's been happening, because I knew that it's something that can happen if we don't just keep quiet and then be moved anyway. So we sat down last Saturday with the residents affected and not affected in solidarity, and we plan to have an action tomorrow and invite the other networks, which like Irish Housing Network, of which we are members of, as well as Mercy. And through those efforts that we decided to take upon ourselves, just today, this morning, after maybe 10:30, after my meeting with the solicitor about that, when I came back, there was an officer from the RIA, or RIA is the Reception and Integration Agency, which is the department, the wing of Justice Department that deals with the accommodation side of direct provision. So the gentleman was there, and somebody says, "There's a person from RIA, he's looking for you." I said, "A person from RIA for what?" I said, "Okay, then I'll wait." And I said, "And I don't know you." When he came, "I don't know you, I've never seen you before." He said, "No, I know you. I met you when you were in Cork." "Okay, that's fine. So what's the story?" I asked. Then he says, "Did you receive the letter?" I said, which letter? Because the last letter that I received was the one that was talking about tomorrow. Then he showed me another letter that was now reversing or extending the deadline for 2 weeks. Okay? Meaning that then immediately that action that we planned to do, we had to rethink that. But I said to the guys, it gives us even more time to plan even bigger when the 2 weeks come. Because I know by the 2 weeks, no one would have received any accommodation at that time, because we are faced with the same problem with HUB. The system now is such that immediately from direct provision, remember you've been stuck there for years. You don't have any assistance whatsoever as to what to do, where to go. You're just on your own. Then you find yourself in the homeless hub. And you go in this private market competing. We can't compete. Where do you work? You know, those questions you can't answer. You've got people that are ready with cash. With HUB, with 1,000 questions that are asked by HUB, it's really made it to be very hard for people in direct provision, and the landlords are running away from it. Though I know it's not legal for them to do, but they do it anyway. We are stuck.
And I know, Lucky, that I mean, I've talked to you about going to, you've been to viewings where there's been 100 people queuing up to see the same apartment. And I mean, even if you, I think, are someone working in tech with a good salary and great references, it can be extremely hard to get anywhere to live in the city at the moment. There are people who work for top tech companies who find themselves living in hotel rooms and B&Bs for weeks, because even with the best references and a good wage, it's extremely hard to get a room. So if you're someone who's living in direct provision, who has not been given the right to work, so, you know, doesn't have any references for possibly the last decade even, you're competing then with people who are willing to pay, you know, above and beyond to get somewhere to live. And, you know, I mean, obviously with the migrant crisis, the refugee crisis across Europe, there has been a tendency to sort of try to, I think, pit the issue of asylum seekers, you know, against the needs of people who are threatened with homelessness, as if the two, you know, you can't find solutions for one or the other, as if asylum seekers in some way are fueling the housing crisis or putting pressure on it. What would you sort of say to that argument?
No, I totally disagree with that, and I believe deep down that the problems that we're facing, we can face them together, and it's not caused by immigration, refugees, or asylum seeker. It's just the attitude of those that are supposed to be taking care of the homelessness, that they just tend their heads away from solving the problem. That is where the problem. It doesn't lie with migrants at all. I know people come with that fear that people come and they get houses and all. That's not the case. I totally disagree with that. We can really, if we work together, we can help each other to. I mean, we have been working with the network for the past 2 years now. You know, we've been to evictions, trying to stop this barbaric way of treating people together, you know. I remember the just up the road, the Grand Common squatter camp. We used to be there to support each other, because on the ground we are all the same. Those that are on top are the ones that want us to see the difference amongst ourselves. But I know the pain that we suffer is the same. So we should give that message to them that, no, we are together, we are equal, and let's find solutions together.
I think that's a really good point, because I think something that the housing crisis in Dublin has done it's been a real leveler in some ways, because I think everyone living in the city is affected by this. If you're a recent graduate, if you're someone working in tech, obviously to different degrees, and there's a huge spectrum, but it does affect everyone. No one is immune from it, and I think anyone renting in Dublin today realizes that really you are one step away from homelessness. If your landlord decides they want to evict you and you can't immediately find somewhere new, you are looking at being homeless. And it is a huge sort of, I think it's really waking people up to how this crisis is affecting a huge range of people, and that it's hopefully going to bring people together increasingly to find solutions to that. And how can people sort of, when it comes to direct provision, how can people best engage with that and work to understand it?
You see, what we are doing is to try and bring the problems of direct provision to the mainstream society, because it's something that is hidden, that is put aside, that people don't realize that there is a problem in direct provision. What we are doing as well on our own initiative is to make people aware that this direct provision exists. This is what is happening. This is what the people in direct provision are going through as well. It's the same, so that we can find the solutions together and not separate people and separate communities. That is what we're trying so hard to make sure that people understand that we are there, people are there, that they don't want to, those people that don't want to us to be seen, we want people to know that we are there and there are problems, and let's get together. That is why we were when the action that we were planning to do, we were including the rest of the community to show up and so that the message goes up there that we have support. We have support from the general community. That is what the message should be. And it's easy. I always say here, it's easy to solve this problem for housing. Yeah, we look for the land, right? Occupy the land and start building. And start building on it. I know there are many houses that are ghost houses, are sitting, and you occupy, you get a court order, and that's it. But if we can be together and say this is a land and we are occupying it, and nobody will put us out of there, and that will be the basic solution.
It's true. I think since the housing crisis has gotten worse and worse, I think mentally we tend to view Dublin as somewhere where it's crammed full, where every house is full and there's just no houses available. But for a recent piece I did for Vice magazine, I interviewed someone who was a squatter for several years in the city, and seeing the city through her eyes, she said they used to drive around and on every street there was a vacant house that they could make a home, literally driving through the city going, oh, well, there's somewhere we could put people to live. And it gives you a different view of the city, that it's not necessarily a lack of space or a lack of housing. It's that there's a lot of vacant properties that are being held on to for the time when, the property owner can make the most money from selling. And I guess this is a good time maybe to sit on to you, Tommy. Working with the Irish Housing Network, you've seen a lot about how government regulation is crucial within the crisis. This issue of vacant properties, I mean, the way the government is portraying this crisis and what you're seeing on the ground, how much of a divide is there between those two realities?
There's 190,000 vacant properties in Ireland, 25,000 of which are ready to go. The rest maybe need to be repaired or are holiday homes, not in convenient places. So yeah, as Lucky says, it's actually easy to solve the housing crisis. We need massive social housing building. We need like 90,000. So I think 10,000 per year, 30,000 per year, something like that. We need rent caps, like a rent freeze to keep rents from going up. Supposedly that was supposed to happen with the 4% freeze in the key zones, but that hasn't been enforced at all. We need mortgage debt relief, as in like write-off mortgage loans, because I think there's like 50,000 mortgages that are in long-term arrears. Those are being sold to vulture funds who are now trying to collect the full loan, which is driving people into the private rental sector, which is driving people into homelessness. So like everything, it's all connected. It's not like the rent stuff is separate from the homeless stuff, is separate from the mortgage stuff, or the same with direct provision, especially people coming out of direct provision, as Lucky said. It's all connected, it's all part of the same story, as it is with the tech stuff. Like, my point is, it's policy driven, and so in 2015 there was a pre-budget submission put forward to the government by Airbnb, which was putting suggestions for tax relief for short-term letting, saying make it easier for people to rent their houses or rooms short-term. 44% of Airbnb users in Ireland are multiple properties. So, I mean, the Airbnb's whole shtick is that it frees up idle properties. Like, that doesn't work in a housing crisis. And there's a housing crisis in pretty much every major city in the world now as well. So it's not like this isn't just happening in Ireland, but it's politics, is I guess my point.
Okay. And we talked a bit before about, the politics within tech. I was reading today about, Facebook building a sort of Facebook village in California, building 1,500 homes specifically for tech workers. You have the Google campuses, and it does seem that we're sort of, the tech industry is building sort of its own cities or its own realities within cities. And of course, with Airbnb, governments are struggling to catch up regulation-wise to new digital industries that are having an impact on, the urban realities, on housing crises in major cities across Europe and elsewhere. And we also spoke before about, the difference in government approach. While they are courting big tech to come and headquarter here in Dublin, which encourages sort of an increase in immigration into the country of highly skilled workers, the treatment of asylum seekers and other people coming into the country is hugely different. How do you see, there has been a big discussion around the social responsibility of big tech and obviously the tax issues in Ireland. Apple has been told to pay Ireland $13 billion in tax that is owed. That could obviously make a big dent in solving the housing crisis and building affordable housing. But how realistic is that to expect sort of tech companies to play a role?
To the extent to act ethically within the law, sure. I don't like to say that tech companies have what's their responsibility? Like they're multinational firms working in a global capitalist economy. Like they don't care about whatever social responsibility they might have or whatever. Really, the question is, what's the responsibility of the state? And that was the question we'd always make when we were doing stuff around local action, say, like making the point that the council, the Dublin City Council, has a duty of care, and the state has a duty of care. And so, like the stuff about it being political is that the this current government since 2011 has built the lowest level of social housing in the history of the state. Their point is, we need to find a market solution. But in the same way we see rents going up because of Airbnb, people knowing they can get more money, letting out their house on a short-term basis over the course of a year, because it's not regulated. And I mean, Airbnb occasionally makes that point that, well, if you just tell us what the regulations are, we'll follow it. But you know, you get the hosts, the people who are like letting out their houses, saying, well, you know, I'm just operating in the market. I'm getting the best price I can. It's up to the government to provide housing. So like real people get stuck in the middle there. Like it's obviously housing. Our point has always been that housing is a fundamental human right, and it's not going to be guaranteed by the market or by big tech firms. But what I would say is, it's not the role of tech firms, big tech companies, and you know why do we say tech? You know, what's big companies? But the question then is, what is the role of tech workers?
Mm-hmm.
And what is the role of tech workers?
That's my point. Is like, why the prefix tech? Like, why, it's we're all in this together. I mean, it's everyone. We're all living in the city. We're all living in the country. It's, you know, we're all, you know, it's the same government, and you know, it's as Lucky and Ashton has said, it's you know, the housing crisis affects us all, and it may affect us in different ways. But, you know,
we're all living in the same city, and I think that's, you know, something that we wanted to engage with through this talk, is that, you know, even if you're working and living in Silicon Docks, you're still living in Dublin, you're still affected by this crisis in some way. And, you know, it would be great to see more of an engagement, I think, between people who are within the tech industry and tech workers. And obviously, the tech industry isn't, you know, the only industry making profit in this country. It's not
there's an interesting thing as well about like the massive student housing that's being built. That's leading to a lot of evictions then around Dublin 1. But the reason that it's student housing being built is because there's fewer restrictions on student housing. You know, the rooms can be smaller. But again, the reason is, you know, a lot of these rooms are going for like €1,000 a month. You know, people working full time can't afford that. I wouldn't be able to afford that. But the reason is, it's pursuing the same strategy that actually a lot of Irish and UK universities are pursuing, which is there's a funding crisis also in education, in third level education, because again, there was money coming from the state, which isn't coming anymore. And so they're trying to go after high fee paying students, particularly from China. And so there's this belief within Irish universities that new rich Chinese students will pay huge fees and that will save our funding crisis. And now it's like, we need new housing developments, we'll build for students.
And I mean, I know that you've been involved with sort of a Europe-wide activism network, and the Irish Housing Network has connected with a lot of different organisations and activist groups across Europe. I mean, the situation in Dublin, I don't think is unique in terms of, you know, the experiences in cities across Europe. How does it compare? I mean, obviously, Dublin is the headquarters for several of these big tech companies, but there are housing crises sort of spreading across Europe.
In Germany and France, I think the issue of transnational landlords is more developed than it is here, but they're starting to move in a much bigger way into the Irish letting market. So particularly along the docks, but it's kind of real estate investment trusts, and that's kind of turning the Irish rental crisis into an investment opportunity for international capital and international transnational landlords. So there's been quite like sophisticated protests or actions against those big actors in Germany and France, but that's something we haven't. That's something that's coming down the road, I suppose, here.
I think we spoke about NAMA before as being, you know, at one point could have been a solution for social housing. And, I was looking into the fact that a lot of the big tech companies that are located in the Docklands have their headquarters there, have are situated in what were NAMA-owned buildings. So the Airbnb headquarters office was a NAMA-owned building that was actually bought by a French investment company. This industrial area was, dilapidated sort of buildings that are now being, renewed and regenerated, and there's a lot of profit to be made.
Well, NAMA, for one thing, will admit already, they have admitted that a lot of the sites and properties they sold haven't actually been occupied yet because the investors that bought them are kind of sitting on them speculating for rising prices. But the thing, like NAMA was based on the Resolution Corporation Trust, I think, which was a bad bank set up in the United States after the Great Depression. So there was similar idea. There was bad loans on the banks that needed to be taken off. So the government set up a bad bank to eat the loans, and then built loads and loads of social housing. So to say, oh, that's not what NAMA was set up for, it was just to fix the economy, is total nonsense, because it was set up with the powers to be able to, it had land, it had the ability to borrow, and it had the ability to lend. So to lend in order to buy the property off NAMA, and to lend to build on the site. And there's no reason they wouldn't have been able to build huge social housing projects. But again, the reason they didn't was political.
Okay. And I guess as well, we've spoken about sort of the engagement with politics when it comes to issues that are, kind of open and friendly. I know that the recent marriage equality movement gained quite widespread support. I know at Gay Pride this year, there was, several floats sponsored by Google, sponsored by Dell. So these tech companies were happy to sort of engage with politics when it came to something that was, sort of non-controversial. But to what extent have any of them engaged with the issue of the housing crisis, which does affect them? I mean, I know that it's a big worry for tech companies too right now, in that people that they're trying to employ are turning down jobs because the rental situation in the city is just so bad. So this does affect, everyone, including those working for tech. Has there been any engagement? I mean, you were involved in the occupation of Apollo House, which gained widespread support, but I mean, has this been something that tech has engaged with at all on a political basis?
I mean, I haven't seen Google or Facebook calling for massive social housing to be built in Ireland or anything like that. But even to make it a simpler argument, what do they have to say about direct provision? They both have, Google and Facebook particularly, or any, say, big tech companies, that depend on a lot of people moving around, people coming into the country or leaving, which is fine. But, okay, what about direct provision? What do they have to say about direct provision? Mm-hmm. Which is detention centres.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think we really want to sort of open it up to questions as well. I'd like to make this a discussion, and as well, if people want to share their own perspectives and experiences of the housing crisis in Dublin, it'd be great to hear a range of perspectives. So I guess we can start with whoever has the first question. There, I don't know if you want to bring a mic or yeah. Oh.
Thanks very much, and thank you to the speakers. My name is Tommy Simpson from the Dublin Council of Trade Unions. We're part of the Housing Coalition, which you all know about, and which is made up of trade unionists, community groups, political activists, etc. So, and we've been campaigning for quite some time now to solve the crisis. But there's a serious problem in this country, and some of you may know of Article 43.3 of the Constitution, which basically states that the exigencies of the common good overrides the right to private property. Now, this has been used in the the 1920s in the building of Marino, in the 1930s, the 40s and 50s, building social housing all over in the Dublin area that I know about. And yet, the Common Gael conservative governments at the time had to agree to that clause in the Constitution, had to go along with it. It has not been used recently. It's been used for building motorways, which is seemingly an exigency, which means there has to be an emergency. And yet they are incapable now of doing what they did in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and right up to the 70s, because they're now basically part of the neoliberal agenda, which is all about private property comes first. And now there have been people like Ed Hogan and others who've called for the use of this clause in the Constitution to be able to purchase land, and it has been done, as I say, in the past. A lot of those sites in Crumlin, Cabra, were actually purchased under compulsory purchase orders. And these people are now saying that we can't do it anymore. They can do it, they just won't do it because of their political bias. Now, there is a part of the housing problem is because it doesn't affect the majority middle class Irish who like to see the value of their property rising. They like to see it, and the Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil party are part of that agenda. And I think something like 28% of members of the Parliament are landlords. So they don't want to see the rents dropping. So, I mean, we need to strengthen the movement and call for the use of the Article 43.3 to be used more strongly. Thank you.
Do you want me to respond? Yeah. Hey, yeah, we are on the National Homeless and Housing Coalition, and it's nice to see somebody here that we're part of. The Hours Convention has brought that up as well an awful lot of times, and we've been looking into that, especially around the family hubs. But we've also looked into it for the Oscar Traynor site, so I know the land sites that you've been talking about. But what we're finding the difficulty is it's got to do with the political parties in our community. An awful lot of the political parties are pushing for the public land to be privatised. And we've seen with the so-called, like, what was it, 25% was going to be social housing, 25% going to be affordable housing, but there's no affordable housing schemes to implement that either. So, like, we're fully behind if the campaign was to be properly organised and to fully push forward in ensuring that communities have a say on the public land that's in their area, to make sure that they lobby the political parties and lobby the council and make sure that action is actually taken to ensure that these lands are used. But we do all need to come together. We need the trade unions, we need those in the tech bubble, in tech land, we need the public services behind us to ensure that the ideology behind privatisation of housing and making housing a commodity is changed. So yeah, I agree with you on the Constitution.
Hello. Quick question. One thing I missed today was the coming impact of Brexit and where tech might be in the same, I don't know, position like you on the stage. Because if the Tory party does everything at the moment in order to drive the bankers out of the city, if all of a sudden 20,000 of 25,000 bankers show up in Dublin, I guess the whole thing becomes a bit more severe, even for the tech guys. Is this something where you see some resonance, or that this kind of topic resonates with the tech industry, that they kind of feel, okay, basically we have to think about it because our coffers aren't as deep as those of the bankers?
Beg your pardon, could you just say the last bit again?
Oh, sorry. So the question was, someone said that the tech companies already realize, okay, their staff has problems, they have problems recruiting the right talent because of the shortage of housing. If now bankers come into that game, or even more bankers come into that game, and one can assume that they have a bigger budget than the average tech guy. Tech becomes, or they have to rethink their position within this framework. That's basically was my question, is are they now starting to think about this from a different perspective, now that they know that probably a lot of bankers will show up on top of those which are already here?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it's, you know, the Brexit stuff. I mean, nobody knows what it's going to look like, for one thing. Will it put additional pressure on housing in Ireland? Yeah, definitely, probably. I mean, definitely, you know what I mean? It's hard to know in what way, but I mean, that's certainly going to coincide with mortgage evictions. So yeah, it's going to be really bad.
Can I add to that? I think with the call out of Cork being the second capital and rebuilding a second city is also another way of looking at where the companies can actually go. Dublin as a city doesn't have to be the only hub because it's technical. It means it can be anywhere in Ireland. It doesn't have to be just in the main city. It can actually be in Longford. It can be in Kildare. So to move the tech not only from Brexit, and we could welcome them in, no problem, if they were going to give back social good and give back to the communities and ensure that families in the areas aren't going to be affected, and that actually we can provide and help each other.
But additionally, like, I was talking to a city planner a little while ago who was saying that one of the main problems for attracting investment or companies outside of Dublin is that the planning is crazy. I mean, like, one of the biggest difficulties for attracting big companies is you can't guarantee electricity. Yeah. Because there might be brownouts because the grid isn't set up to be able to accommodate that kind of like civic infrastructure or like that kind of office space. And so, I mean, like, a lot of these issues are really issues of planning. I mean, there's so much vacant space above shops in town, but they're zoned in a certain way. There's no vacancy tax for empty houses. The fact even that in Dublin, say, there's 3 different city councils that are responsible for four different city councils responsible for different parts of the city, but they don't talk to each other. They don't plan together. So they compete for different developments against each other, and it leads to really crazy, weird, like, that they grow separately, and like it's that could be a solution, sure, but we definitely need to change the way planning works anyway.
There's no central planning.
There's no central planning, yeah.
Maximum distance. Hang on. No, it's for the people in the stream, otherwise they won't know what you're saying. I'll be quick.
Yes. Thank you very much. Okay, I just have a very, very quick question. I've sat here for the last hour listening to an awful lot of information which I wasn't aware of, some of which was upsetting and some of it was also a little bit agitating, I don't mind saying. I imagine a lot of people feel the same way. You've also been talking a lot about how the responsibility should be taken by the government to change policies, but the question is very simple. Speaking as someone who's renting and is living in an insecure situation, like I imagine many people in the room, what is it that you'd like me, as an ordinary person, to help, to do, to contribute to the cause?
As our group, we would love you to get involved in knowing your own rights and helping and support other tenants in knowing their own rights and actually going to services with each other, because only together, by learning from each other, will we empower each other. I feel that as you are affected yourself, that if we get rid of the stigma that we all need houses, that it's not just about those that are homeless on the streets, that have addictions and that they're complex needs. We all have needs. So as an individual that's a private renter, you can easily get involved by ensuring that other people, you know your rights, you know how to fight your rights, you ensure that you take cases against your landlord if you feel that it's invalid or it's wrong, and you put that out there to the public on how you did your fight and who supported you during your fight and how hard it was actually to access the services and what's lacking in the services, and push that the services create a better platform to ensure that everyone's protected. That's what I feel personally from community sector.
No, she's definitely right, and I think it's also very important that one can start acting before you actually affected by a situation, because half the time we ignore situations until it really hits home, and by that time maybe you don't even have those links. There are so many groups that people can join and learn and help each other. And you might think you know your rights, but these legislations keep changing, and you'll be trapped. We don't want people to start acting when they are outside. Let's act while you still have a home. Mm.
I'd like to know why we will allow the local authorities, as somebody mentioned there's 3 of them, why do we allow them to abdicate their responsibility? The local authorities were responsible for building houses, and the CPO that our friend from the union talked about can be used and has been used, but the local authority don't want to know, mainly because the unions don't want to know and the local authorities. But the second question is, why do housing agencies, especially the largest housing agencies, take so long to build some houses? In other words, we're involved in a particular project in the south of Dublin where they've been involved for 3 years and they still can't get through 8 apartments in Dunleary Rathdown. Now, it's basically, to my mind, down to the fact that there is so many different bodies, there's so many different agencies, there's so many local authorities. The planning is back in the dark ages. It closes at 4 p.m. It doesn't open till 10. You know, and I'm talking as a landlord, so I'm probably one of the despised species here today, right? But I can't see why. I mean, the largest agency, it's absolutely criminal. They have a property for the last 3 years. I won't mention the name of it. They have sat on it. They have tossed it around between one to another. No one takes any responsibility. This is the classic situation in Ireland. The local authorities take no responsibility, and that's why we have a housing crisis. We had no money in 2013 and 14. The vulture funds came in. You can't blame the vulture funds. But I blame the local authorities because they have the money now, they have the impetus from political situation, but they've been allowed, and I don't understand why, and that's my question. Why are we allowing them to abdicate? And why are we allowing the large housing agencies to dither around? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hey, it's okay to be a landlord. It's just make sure you're a good one. But it is okay to be a landlord. Do you know what I mean? Like, we need to get rid of that stigma as well for the landlords. We need landlords to come out and fight for social housing. We need landlords to come together with the mortgage association as well and make sure that housing is provided. Do you know what I mean? So it's okay to make a profit in the private market, but why should we not have a public access to housing for everybody? Like, it shouldn't be income-based either, I don't believe. But anyway, what I feel for that one is the council is so hard to hold accountable because they passed the book. And as a community group, we've taken actions in the council. We've done sit-ins, we've done sleep-outs outside, we've really tried to hold them accountable. But it's hard to get people involved because we were kind of trying to be branded as like a mob, you know, sitting in, looking for our free houses, looking for this, but we were looking for access to services and answers when we did our sit-ins, and it worked. We had an awful lot of families that couldn't access emergency accommodation and they were sleeping. Sent to guard stations, and we had to link them in. I took an awful lot of homeless families into my own home for a night to ensure that they could access the services the next day. And like that, we had to do sit-ins to make sure that they were able to access emergency accommodation. So it takes action to hold accountability, I feel, and it's unfortunate that not enough people are coming forward on the ground to take that action. It's legal. It's not like as if we're doing something that is going to create harm to anybody else. It's actually improving quality of life for the individual and for the children that are affected.
I can understand the councils, but I can't understand the housing agencies.
They're all linked. Like the housing agency, to us, like, I didn't even know the housing agency was separate to the council until we met Coveney in the agency. But when we look at the voluntary sector, the movement from the council into the voluntary sector is washing their hands of their responsibility. And when they go to the council say it's government policy, that they have no responsibility. It's actually the policy that's being implemented by our government. So it's just passing the buck all the time. And like you said, we should have the trade unions in pushing, but unfortunately we don't have that. We should have every worker that's like linked in with a trade union as well, making sure that their voices are being heard within the structure of providing housing. Sorry?
And one thing as well is that how like disempowered the councils have become over the past few decades, and at the same time the management within the councils getting much more power, and oftentimes they're disappeared for the executive or the government. So that, like, say there was the big land sell-off, or say like Oscar Traynor and those sites, where there was a plan put forward from the management where they put out a tender for financing and building, but it was in like finance trade magazines. But my point is that oftentimes the council will do something and then the councillors will read about it in the paper.
Yeah, we can see that with the family hubs. Just to bring it back to the family hubs, where there's a Bargain Town out in Coolock. It's a warehouse. It's the offices of Bargain Town, and that has been leased for the next 5 years to a charity sector to provide the family accommodation. And what we're seeing with that was there was no community consultation. It was a councillor that had brought it forward because he wasn't even notified about what was actually going on. So we're seeing fast tracking that's happening from the council without actually contacting what's the community or the planning in the community or the council in the community, and that's coming from the management, that's coming from the executives. So you can see that they have their own plan and they're going to implement it without the say of the communities or those that are affected.
Would the panel consider the low level of taxation paid by the tech companies as having contributed towards the housing crisis in Ireland, and the fact that Apple have still got 13 billion sitting in an account in Europe, would that be put to better use in building all those social housing units?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, it was a deal. Like, it was the government didn't want the tax, so I think there's a thing that if it was collected, it would have to go into writing down debt, but that would free up other money to then build housing. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's the thing. They're firms working in the capitalist economy. They're going to like get away with whatever they can. It's up to the government to say, no, you have to pay your tax, and that's not what the government did. And that's the thing. It's the government or the state. I mean, the policy. The economic policy of the state for decades has been trying to course foreign direct investment, and so the idea was you don't have to pay. They paid like $2 billion in tax, I think. Was it? It was 2%. Sorry, it was 2%. 2%.
Sorry, you'd agree then that they're okay to pay that level of taxation? That's what I heard you say.
They didn't. They weren't paying the low corporation tax that we.
No, you said that rewarded this low level to them, and that they're well within the rights to pay it. But you wouldn't be against that.
I wouldn't. Pardon?
You said that you were.
Sorry, do you want to bring the mic up?
If you don't have the microphone, I'll be happy to relay. We'll come back up to you with a microphone. Okay, here you go. And this will have to be our final question.
So you said that the government have set the taxation levels, which they have, and that it's okay for the tech companies to pay that level of taxation. That's what you said?
No, my point is...
No, that's what you said.
Well, I'm sorry if it was misinterpreted. My point is that it was found by the EU that the level of tax that Apple was paying was breaking EU rules. So they were paying lower than the corporation tax rate in Ireland. So no, I don't think that's okay. And I think the money that they should have been paying should have gone into building social housing. Sure. Do you want to add anything, Ash, or Lucky?
I'd just like to recommend watching the video of our previous speaker on exactly this topic of taxation.
Great, and I think we are out of time. But thank you everyone for coming, and thanks to everyone here for speaking. I hope it was of interest. Okay.